talks. So if I make a mistake, please be understanding. So welcome everyone. Today we're going to have two great presentations, but first we're going to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we are standing today. We pay our respects to elder, past and present, and thank you, Ren, for presenting today, for being here as well, especially you. And first of all, we're going to have Natalie Lazaroo with a presentation titled Reframing Home through Socially Engaged Circus Work with Survivors of Domestic Violence. And then, Ren, we talk about learning from the voices of our Indigenous teachers. So to be quick and mindful of everyone's time, please, Natalie, you can start. The floor is yours.
Alrighty, so my presentation is about a socially engaged performance project that I was involved in a few years ago. And it involved creating a new circus work with women survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. So the stuff I'm presenting today is drawn from a book chapter that I've written that's currently in press. And that book focuses on the theme of performing homescape. So in this paper, I'm really looking at how the notion of home is framed and reframed through performance work. So while it's not education in that sense, I hope it will still be of interest to some of you in terms of social justice work in a community context. Now, before I talk about the concepts and an analysis of the work, I thought I might begin with an impression of the performance just to set the scene and give you some insight into what the show looked like. So I'm gonna read out a narrative vignette. The stage image resembles a domestic scene with chairs, a dining table, two standing lamps, and a large hanging picture frame. As the performance begins, the stage goes dark except for the light emitted by the two lamps. Gentle music starts to play, and slowly more light appears as the performers enter the space, floating illuminated teacups across the stage like a dance. The performers come to a line upstage where the jaunty music that has been playing cuts out and is replaced by the rattling of the teacups as the line of women slowly moves forward towards the audience. The line freezes. Silent screams are made into the teacups. All goes black. A deep rumbling echoes through the space. The lights cut out, and each time they come back on, more and more of the pristine domestic setting is upturned until it looks like a hurricane has torn through it. The music changes again, this time uplifting, and performers take turns to step through the hanging picture frame, presenting themselves to the audience. The first video story begins, featuring one of the women as she swings gently on the picture frame. In the video story, she is seen lovingly holding and tapping against an emu collar, a hollow piece of wood used to call emus away from their eggs, a gift painted by her uncle. Throughout the performance, the women narrate stories of survival and resilience through both text and physical imagery. Some moments are tender, a pleasant teacup dance while sitting at the kitchen table. Some are tense, large binders falling from the ceiling, loud thuds reverberating as a lone woman walks through the space. Some are filled with chaos, women tearing through the space, ripping up sheets of paper in cathartic release. As the final video story is shared with the audience, a loud call is heard. This is a warning. The women dance their final dance. It is one of victory. A wall of women meets the eyes of the audience. So that was just a little narrative to set the scene. And I'll just provide a very quick background to the project. So back in 2021, feminist organization Vulcana Circus staged Circus in a Teacup at the Queensland Performing Arts Centre, or QPAC. The project was a collaboration between 6 women from the Vulcana community, myself included, and 8 women who were survivors of gender-based and domestic violence. So these 8 women had signed up to be involved in the project through Brisbane Domestic Violence Services MICA Projects program. So in this presentation, I'll refer to them sometimes as the MICA Projects women. So the MICA Project supports Brisbane women and children to feel safe and free from fear of domestic and family violence, or DFV for short. So over 4 months, we met once a week and we worked together to create stories of survival and resilience through the languages of circus and physical storytelling. So the process was facilitated by Vulcana's artistic director, Celia White, and former longtime trainer and community cultural development coordinator, Michelle Grant-Iram, who also works at Griffith, as a side note. So because my paper on my presentation focuses on home and reframing home, I'm just going to draw on 2 main parts of my book chapter to talk about today. So the first is how the work challenged common understandings of home as safe haven or home as safe space. And the second part looks at how circus performance disturbed metaphors of the domesticated female body. So my discussions are drawn primarily from research conversations with 6 of the MICA Project's women who took part, and I frame these discussions largely within the field of feminist geographies. So feminist geographies centralize lived experiences, embodiment, feelings and emotions of women felt in places, in analyses of people and place. And so I argue here that the work, the circus work, created an undomesticated ground to disturb or to shift some of the common spatial metaphors of home, as well as the domesticated female body. So to that first point, I think maybe it's important to unpack this term home. So we often think about creating safe space, and that home is somewhere that people can retreat to from the world, right? So in this respect, when I was theorizing it, I turned to French philosopher Gaston Bachelat's influential work in conceptualizing space, dwelling, and home. So Bachelat believed that the intimacy that homes and houses provide create a fertile ground for the imaginary to thrive. So for Bachelat, the imaginary is a space of freedom and possibilities and choices. However, lots of feminist geographers especially have challenged this notion of home as safe haven, right? So to feminist geographers, home is a radical political site. So their critique of Bachelat's work is that Bachelat was often apolitical. So what these feminist geographers were saying is that when you indiscriminately construct the home space as a haven, you're ignoring how home can sometimes be a contested site of power and identity. And so when you think about this within the context of domestic violence, we see that domestic violence is often rendered invisible, right? It's often rendered invisible when you through the ideological scripting of home as intimate and safe. So you're ignoring people who fall outside that category or experience. Now, when I spoke to the women involved in the project, a few of them kind of reflected on this problematic notion of home as safe space. So one of the women, Marcel, reflected on an aerial chair act that was performed in the show, and you can see an image there on the slide. So during this particular sequence, I had to kind of navigate my way through a very, very small and very tight frame of an aerial chair as it was going up and down through the space. So Marcel said, I remember you, referring to me, of course, I remember you climbing on that chair, but I also remember the lyrics or the music going, this space is getting too small. And so it challenged the idea that home was this expanse of warm, safe space. Sometimes home is incredibly dangerous and small, and we need to leave. And another woman, Angela, also noted the relevance of this aerial chair act to her own life. And she shared, you're contorting yourself to get through that chair. That spoke to me too. Like how you make yourself small and try to fit, and you never quite do. You never nail it. It's not good enough. And it felt uncomfortable and distorted, and that's how I felt in my home. Some of the other women pointed to how there's an inherent danger contained within what might be referred to as ordinary objects in the home. So Lisa, one of the participants, mentioned that every house has a dining table and chairs, and you have to sit around that no matter what's happening. And that was so central in the performance, sitting around that table, rocking people on that table, things that can be used for boring purposes, or that sort of use in a domestic violence situation, where the table is moving, it's not safe. So even those ordinary objects, they're not always safe. So what we saw is how household objects that might initially come across as familiar and mundane, so things like the kitchen table, the chairs, even the teacups, can begin to disrupt common spatial metaphors of home as safe haven. So how the performance approached this disruption was that it presented these objects as threatening, as unstable and unpredictable, thereby unsettling the normative associations between home and positivity. Because as I said before, that home as safe haven trope is problematized. Yet at the same time, here is where the process of creating circus work with survivors could also challenge narratives and representations of women who have gone through and who have survived domestic violence, right? So I just shared how the performance played with these images of ordinary household objects as potentially threatening and dangerous. So one of the examples from the participants that I shared earlier referred to how the dining table was used to create feelings of instability and precariousness. So one of the things that we played around with in the project was having people stand on a table and just feel what it was like with everyone else kind of just shaking it and moving it around. So when I spoke to one of the women, Sasha, she mentioned how when she was invited to climb onto the table during one of the sessions, she said, that's when I felt like this feels what I'm going through, but I'm hanging on. It was an awakening. So for someone like Sasha, standing on top of the table as it shook beneath her was not merely an image or sensation of passivity and helplessness. Rather, the turbulence that she experienced, so both physically through that shaking table, as well as what was happening in her own personal life, was actually countered by Sasha having to actively hold her balance, right? She had nothing to grab onto, but she had to stand there and kind of balance herself while the table was shaking beneath her. And there was also a sense of self-realization that came with that awakening. For Marcel, another woman, being able to stand on the table as it was shaking, to her was a strong statement. So she said, over time, doing these little things, like when I climbed on the table, and she acknowledged that even though it's very simple, mentally for her, it's very challenging. And she also said, I always grew up a very sporty girl. Then after what I went through, I find all that stuff incredibly challenging to push through. And then seeing myself push through it, I was really empowered after that. So when we think about domestic violence context, right, we see that the exertion of power on the body is emphasized. So while I think it's important to acknowledge that not all forms of domestic violence are physical, so you have things like coercive control, etc., scholars have usefully argued that for women who have experienced abusive relationships, whether it's physical or non-physical, defenselessness is embodied in the flesh, right? So a range of problems beyond just that physical injury is often manifested through the body. And also, if we think about if you think about what has been theorized about bodies as sites of power and control, the body is often considered the primary site for the operation of modern forms of power. And these forms of power can be subtle, they can be elusive, and they can also be productive. And so I think it's significant that the women involved in the project could reclaim power in and through their bodies. So one of the women, Alice, talked about how For all of us, so for all the women who came into the project and who had experience of domestic violence, what we lived through is someone telling us that we're absolutely useless, we're pathetic, we're ugly, we're fat, we're not capable of making even the smallest decision. So to go from being this person who doesn't believe you're capable of anything, to then understanding that you actually have all this power in your body and strength in your mind to overcome the discomfort that takes, that's a huge gift. Some of the other women similarly reflected on discovering a shift in their sense of embodiment. For instance, Marcel shared, I really loved feeling how strong I was. I was particularly good at being a base. So that term base is a circus term where you basically have people climb and stand on you. So that's a base. And I was particularly good at being a base and people climbing on my back. And I was like, wow, I am really strong. And it was challenging to get that out of your head. I was like, no, they're going to hurt me. They're going to crumple me. So she had these feelings that her body wasn't going to be strong enough to hold the weight of the other women. So through these examples and through these discussions, the idea of home as a differentiated space of both resistance and oppression is made evident. So home can be a site where aggressive forms of misogyny are exercised, but it can also be a site of resistance. And we see this through how the women's bodies became reframed in the process. So within the performance, the body actively became a site of women's subversive practices and struggles for self-determination and empowerment. And so it allowed the MICA Project's women in particular to reclaim their sense of self by reconnecting with their bodies in positive ways. And it started to unmake the constructs of the docile and disempowered body that had been produced through domestic violence. So just to kind of wrap up, I've discussed how the notion of home can be reframed through performance, through the intentional visual images in the show in Circus in a Teacup that communicated that sense of inherent danger located within the home. The home as safe space or safe haven trope rather became problematized, bringing to light how the very notion of home itself is an ideological space, right? Home has been theorized as being both a place and an idea, and it's an ideological space where and a political site where power can be exerted. Engaging with such political structures meant that the project allowed for an exploration of home as an embodied and differentiated space of both oppression and resistance. And also the nature of feminist circus allowed for a reconfiguration of the female body, one that destabilizes notions of docility and domesticity. So for the women who have survived domestic violence, reclaiming one's body and power within that body is all the more significant, considering how patriarchal control is often located in women's bodies. Now, while I didn't explicitly talk about this in this presentation, I think it was important that the project involved working sensitively with a focus on the women's stories of survival, where participants could build relationships and trust and develop a sense of solidarity. And they also talked about finding a sense of validation, which was something that had initially been a challenge for many of the women coming through the project. And I thought it would be nice to end off with the voices of the women involved. So I'm going to play you a 3-minute video of the women talking about their experiences in the project. Oops, sorry.
One of the things about circus and why there are women's circuses is because there's something particular about women discovering their own strength. So we provide a space where women can explore and try and test their strength in a space which is supportive, and we use it to bring people together.
Circus in a Teacup is a project for women who have survived domestic violence.
Whatever background you're from, this can affect anyone and everyone in the same way. For me, it is really important to stand up, be seen, because often I've felt invisible in this situation.
I've spoken to people about my story and it never sort of comes across the way I want it to. But this, I think, just brings that emotion and that vulnerability that people can be inspired by. It elevates the voices that aren't heard all the time, and I think that's an important part of eliciting empathy in our community.
There's just a level of power within yourself where you just go, this is amazing. You need to trust people because they're holding you and you're standing on top of them, and so it's that trust that that they won't let you fall.
Really daunting, but I didn't see it as being brave. But yeah, now I reflect on it, I guess we are really brave because we're just normal people standing in front of hundreds of people we don't know, and a lot of us are telling our very personal stories.
I think the people that stand on stage after a process like that take that power. And audiences, I think, recognise that. Being in a space like this and having the fabulous support that QPAC's given this project just makes people take it seriously.
It's challenged me, but it's like empowering. Like I'm jumping on a table and I'm like surfing the table, and it's also allowed me to redevelop a bit of trust in people and women.
We were just a bunch of women, didn't know each other, and it was quite scary because we were pretty much stepping on each other.
When your trust has been broken like that with someone that you love deeply, it's very, very hard to trust other people, and it's also very hard to trust yourself.
I've gained an amazing group of friends, a huge amount of support through the process because things continue on. So it's given me a bit of a place of escape and something to really look forward to. You feel less alone in it because you've got other people there on the journey with you.
One of our performers said, we want this show to be a warning. We can't wait for policy, we can't wait for violence to just evaporate. We have to take action.
All right, that's it. Thank you. And just a quick plug, we are doing another iteration of this project this year, so tickets will be on sale later in the year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for your great presentation. I think that is so touching, important, and heartfelt for all of us interested in these kind of topics. I was wondering whether anyone or someone had any questions for Nat.
Thank you for the comments in the chat. Happy to chat more about this project, the project just that I showed you, or what's happening this year. So Judy Rose, I'm not sure if she's here in the presentation, but she and I are kind of working on this iteration of Circus in a Teacup.
So comments, questions. We organized today's lightning talk so we could have the time to provide feedback and ask questions about the projects. Sasha, please.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you so much. That was a really moving project, very powerful. I was wondering, what was the audience's reaction and everything? Because you've kind of taken the private and put it into the public's face. And how was their response? And then how did the woman find that response? Like, how did that impact them in return?
Yeah, great. Great question. I think it was mixed. Most audiences were family and friends. So there was a sense of, there was a strong level of supportive support. Of course, there were people who didn't get it because it wasn't a kind of narrative storytelling way, but it's all circus, right? So some people just didn't get it in terms of what was being told. But I think when I spoke to some of the women, I think their families actually saw them differently because they hadn't, the women who came through the MIC projects, none of them had any performance experience. Circus was a new thing, and I think circus is a different kind of performance in itself, right? And they said how it shifted the way that even their family who knew about their experiences of domestic violence saw them as powerful, as like one of the women said, like, I wasn't seen as this wallflower anymore, right? Taking the stage, and in a professional venue as well. I think that really elevated their voices. And as Celia in that video shared about actually the support, because you're performing in this professional location, I think it just makes people take notice a bit more. And one of the women said, you know, like this performance, I stood in front of hundreds of people for 3 nights. Why should I be scared anymore about speaking about this experience to other people? So she started taking a more active role in terms of advocating, educating people about domestic violence.
That's so awesome. I am very interested in seeing the next version. So thank you for a powerful presentation. It's amazing.
Paolo tried to talk before. Paolo, do you want to say something?
I just put something on the chat, Natalie, so, you know, really apologise. I was caught up in a meeting with the department. So I didn't hear the front part, but, do you know, there's a lot of work now, it's probably quite old, but it's being resurfaced, and it's from some of the psychoanalytic literature where they talk about movement and the importance of movement as a healing process and the kind of energy that gets released through that. So where I'm coming from here is the talk about you first feel the pain in your body before you can actually articulate it and put it into words. And so I was just thinking through whether that pain in the body that's been experienced through that trauma has to be healed first through bodily movement before they can actually start putting it into a verbal language. I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. And I think even with this project, so back in 2021, it was an explicit choice that there will be no talk of domestic violence, right? That no one was asked to share their experience of domestic violence or any stories of domestic violence. It was purely a physical skills exchange, connecting with each other process. So, because one of the women, when she joined an early session, she said, are we going to be talking about our experiences? Because I don't want to do that. And you know, there was no talk. If what happened was sometimes when the women felt more comfortable with each other, they might just out of the actual process just be talking about stuff, right? So I didn't talk about this in the paper, but it does come up in the book chapter that I've written, that a lot of the women said that they had been reading about how trauma is contained in the body, and they thought joining something physical like circus could help them work through it. So a lot of times the women said, because they realized that their bodies just refuse to do certain things, like the notion of touch is really central in circus, and the fact that, you know, they didn't trust that other women would keep them safe to do all these risky physical stuff. But I think once that trust had been built through the sessions week after week, they realized that they could, I guess, trust the other women to keep them physically and emotionally safe. But coming back, Paolo, to your question, there was not a single instance in the creative process where the women survivors were invited to share stories of domestic violence. So the focus was on creating physical images of survival and celebration, I guess. Does that respond kind of to the question?
Perfect. No, brilliant.